Themselves for the record. My name is Nathan Neudorf. I'm the MLA for Lethbridge East and the chair of this committee. We will begin by starting to my right.
Good afternoon. I'm Nicole Goring, the MLA for Edmonton Castle Downs and the deputy chair of this committee.
Good afternoon. Miranda Rosen, MLA for Banff Kananaskis.
Afternoon, everyone. Cyril Turton, MLA for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Good afternoon, everyone. MLA Jackie Armstrong-Humnick, Fort Saskatchewan, Vegreville.
Afternoon. I'm Peter Guthrie, Airdrie Cochrane.
Good afternoon. Devinder to MLA Calgary Falconridge.
Good afternoon. Kathleen Ganley, Calgary Mountain View.
Good afternoon. Rachel Notley, MLA Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you very much. Now we will go to the members participating virtually. When I call your name, please introduce yourself for the record. Mr. Roswell.
Garth Rosal, MLA, Vermilion Lloydminster Wainwright.
Mr. Walker.
Good afternoon. Jordan Walker, MLA Sherwood Park.
Thank you very much. Due to the current landscape we are in, all ministry staff will be participating in the estimates debate virtually. Premier, please introduce yourself, and if any of your officials are called upon to respond to a question, I would ask them to introduce themselves at that time.
Okay, thank you, Chair and members. It's an honor to be here, and thanks for doing this in a COVID-safe way. And I am, you wanted me to introduce the folks who are with me, is that correct, Chair?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
So I'm joined by the Deputy Minister for Executive Council, Ray Gilmore, and Associate Deputy Minister at Executive Council, Colleen Volk, who helps me with my capacity as Minister for Intergovernmental Relations. Dana Hugman, who is Executive Director and Senior Financial Officer for Financial Services at Executive Council. Mark Cameron, Deputy Minister of Policy Coordination Office, Chris McPherson, DM for the Cabinet, Deputy Secretary to Cabinet, excuse me. And I have some political staff here as well.
Thank you very much, Premier. I'd like to note the following substitutions for the record. Mr. Turton for Mr. Reid, Mr. Tour for Mr. Barnes, Mr. Guthrie for Mr. Van Dyken. Before we begin, I would note that in accordance with the recommendations from the Chief Medical Officer of Health, attendees at today's meeting are advised to leave the appropriate distance between themselves and other meeting participants. In addition, as indicated in the February 25th, 2021 memo from the Honourable Speaker Cooper, I would remind everyone of committee room protocols in line with health guidelines, which require members to wear masks in committee rooms and while seated, except when speaking, at which time they may choose not to wear a face covering. A few housekeeping items to address before we turn to the business at hand. Please note that the microphones are operated by Hansard staff. Committee proceedings are being live streamed on the internet and broadcast on Alberta Assembly TV. The audio and video stream and transcripts of meetings can be accessed via the Legislative Assembly website. Those participating virtually are asked to turn on their camera while speaking, and please mute your microphone when not speaking. To be placed on the speakers list, virtual participants should email or send a message to the group chat to the committee clerk, and members in the room are asked to please wave or otherwise signal to the chair. Please set your cell phones and other devices to silent during the duration of the meeting. Speaking rotation and time limits. Honourable members, the standing order set out the process for consideration of the main estimates. A total of 2 hours has been scheduled for consideration of the estimates for Executive Council. Standing Order 59.017 establishes the speaking rotation and speaking times. In brief, the Premier will have 10 minutes to address the committee. At the conclusion of his comments, a 50-minute speaking block for the official opposition begins, followed by a 20-minute speaking block for independent members, if any, and then a 20-minute speaking block for the government caucus. Individuals may only speak up to 10 minutes at a time, but time may be combined between the member and the Premier. The rotation of speaking time will then follow the same rotation of the official opposition, independent members, and government caucus, with individual speaking time set to 5 minutes for both the member and the ministry. These times may be combined into a 10-minute block. One final note, please remember that discussion should flow through the chair at all times, regardless of whether or not speaking times are combined. If members have any questions regarding the speaking times or the rotation, please feel free to send an email or message to the committee clerk about the process. Ministry officials at the direction of the Premier may address the committee. Ministry officials are asked to please introduce themselves for the record prior to commenting. Space permitting, the opposition caucus staff may sit appropriately distant at the table to assist their members. However, members have priority to sit at the table at all times. If debate is exhausted prior to 2 hours, the ministry's estimates are deemed to have been considered for the time allotted in the schedule, and the committee will adjourn. Points of order will be dealt with as they arise. However, the speaking block time and the overall 2-hour meeting clock will continue to run. Any written material provided in response to questions raised during the main estimate should be tabled by the Premier in the Assembly for the benefit of all members. The vote on the estimates and any amendments will occur in Committee of Supply on March 17th, 2021. Amendments must be in writing and approved by Parliamentary Council prior to the meeting at which they are to be moved. The original amendment is to be deposited with the committee clerk, and as a courtesy, an electronic version of the signed original should be provided to the committee clerk for distribution to committee members. I now invite the Premier to begin his opening remarks. Premier, you have 10 minutes.
Well, thanks again, Mr. Chairman, and to all of you colleagues. I'm getting an echo. You're good? All right, thanks. So, and let me also say thank you to all of the staff at Executive Council represented by the deputies here. It's a great team of talented, hardworking leaders who have risen to the occasion during unprecedented times over this past year of crisis to help get Albertans through this challenging time. The staff at Executive Council provide professional, unbiased support and guidance as we continue to focus on protecting lives and livelihoods through the COVID-19 pandemic and the associated economic crisis. We all, of course, Executive Council's central role is to be the central executive coordinating body of the broader Alberta Public Service and to provide support to Executive Council, to Cabinet, to me as Premier, and has a particular additional role to support me, as mentioned, as Minister responsible for intergovernmental relations, which means all of our efforts to work with other Canadian provincial and territorial governments, the Government of Canada, and foreign governments. It's a small but very busy part of government. Executive Council is leading by example with its own budget. Alberta's finances, as we know, have been hit hard by the collapse in energy prices last year in the world economy. And we all saw that in the Minister Tay's recent budget. And as you know, we're trying to demonstrate or show greater efficiencies and find savings right across government, as Executive Council has been doing. The Executive Council budget is, however, increasing from last fiscal year as we are transferring into it a small unit of staff from the Department of Energy with about a $2 million transfer to create a secretariat to coordinate Alberta's advocacy efforts on the environmental, social, and governance metrics of international investors in our energy sector. So that's a clean transfer of about 11 full-time equivalent employees, representing $1.5 million in salaries and benefits and about $500,000 in associated costs. We've also had more virtual meetings, of course, fewer in-person meetings, and so saved money this past year on travel and associated costs. We're projected to save about $334,000 on that in the fiscal year just ending. So savings through staff management are as well have been achieved by not automatically filling vacancies. We know we've been managing overall employee levels across the government through primarily through attrition. We've also saved $10,000 a year from eliminating landlines on telephones in most of our offices. And the Office of the Deputy Minister of Executive Council spends about $1.4 million to provide policy advice as well as support on operations and management of issues. The Cabinet Coordination Office has a budget of just over $900,000 for organization and administrative support to the Cabinet. The Policy Coordination Office works with the Cabinet Coordination Office to provide policy support and legislative support, including to the Legislative Review Committee of Cabinet, and they do that with a $2.8 million budget. The Operations and Machinery of Government Unit at Executive Council works with all ministries, tracks cross-government programs and projects with a $440,000 budget. Intergovernmental relations takes on, is of course an area that has particular urgency right now as we fight for a fair deal for Alberta in the Federation. And they help to support for example, the Fair Deal panel. We've had a very high pace of activity in the IGR mandate this past year, partly because of COVID. We've had, on average, meetings with the other premiers every other week and with the Prime Minister every other week. Of course, a much higher pace of just liaising with different federal departments as well. And of course, an increased pace of activity in dealing with the United States and various governments south of the border. So it's been a very busy year for that section IGR with a $5.6 million budget. We have, of course, the Protocol Office as well. They've been less busy in terms of events, of course, this year, but they did lead the COVID safe swearing in of our wonderful new Lieutenant Governor, the Honorable Selma Lakhani, and they've been, very helpful. Actually, I have to say, was as our cabinet committees have been meeting in helping to support that in a COVID safe way. The Lieutenant Governor's office has a budget of $600,000 to help Her Honor fulfill her duties representing the sovereign. And so all of that adds up to an Executive Council budget of $18.3 million. And I'm pleased to report that that's been coming down every year that I've been in this position. The 2019 actuals, for example, were 18.8 million, and this year we're budgeting $18.26 million. Let me say a couple of words, Chair, if I have time, about Budget 2021. Of course, a budget about healthcare and jobs with a $1.25 billion contingency for COVID-related health costs and a $900 million increase in the baseline budget for healthcare, in part to help Alberta's government achieve our ambitious strategy goal of reducing surgical wait times to 4 months or less within clinical guidelines. I want to thank, speaking of the pandemic management, I want to thank Dr. Hinshaw and her team of public health experts and everybody right across the system for their remarkable dedication in keeping Albertans safe, and underscore that at the same time, we must all work together to address the economic crisis. Thankfully, we see signs of significant recovery, as mentioned in the chamber today. Banks are now projecting that Alberta may lead the country in economic growth this year, but we are putting the pedal to the metal with Alberta's recovery plan, including with the $500 million contingency for economic growth initiatives to broaden and diversify Alberta's economy while ensuring a strong future for our largest industries like energy, of course. And with that, Chair, I'll yield back the balance of my time so that you and members can have more time to ask questions. I look forward I hope this will be an informative exchange and a good opportunity for accountability.
Thank you very much, Premier. Just for everybody's notice, I will try to indicate when you have 1 minute of speaking time left, if that is helpful. That way you're less interrupted, but you know approximately when your time will come to an end. For the following 50 minutes, members of the official opposition and the Premier may speak. The timer will be set for 20-minute intervals, so you are aware of that time. Ms. Notley, would you wish to share time with the Premier?
Yes, I think that is certainly the best way to go, and so we'll give that a shot, and hopefully it will work.
Premier, are you agreeable to shared time?
Sure. I don't know how the other approach works, so it's the only way I know it.
Simple. Ms. Notley, you may begin your time.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the Premier for those introductory comments. And maybe I can begin by mirroring what you had to say with respect to the public servants who are joining you there today, and offering, of course, as well, the thanks of the official opposition to them for their leadership and I'm sure never-ending hard work over the course of the pandemic and the crisis that we've been facing since we've last had a chance to discuss the budget, which is actually, I guess, about 16, 17 months now, going back to the fall of 2019. So big thanks to them, and also, of course, to officials in health who I know are not with you here today, but to Dr. Hinshaw, to all the people who work with her, and frankly to all our public servants who have been on the front line supporting Albertans throughout this very difficult time, both directly in the public service as well as indirectly through other agencies of public service. So thank you to all those folks. I think I'd like to begin my questions in sort of a very granular way, and then just by looking at some pieces with respect to your office and its functioning, and then I'll sort of move out from there to talk a little bit about the intergovernmental issues that you rightly identified. I do have some questions there, and then some questions around job creation, which the Premier also identified, as well as ultimately, if we have time, some questions on your ESG Secretariat. So, but I would like to begin just talking a little bit about and asking some questions about your office. And of course, my reference on this is the business plan reference 1.1 and 1.2, as well as the estimate stock reference, page 103, and the fiscal plan reference with respect to the FTEs. So, to begin with, I guess, as you know, the Public Sector Compensation Transparency Act requires all political contracts above $111,000 to be posted publicly. But as of most recently, those postings seem to be out of date to some degree. In particular, there appears to be outdated contracts posted for your Chief of Staff, your Deputy Chief of Staff, and also your Senior Policy Advisor. Now, I appreciate that. I believe that there are contracts there for them that relate to their previous positions, but there are no contracts posted for their current positions. And so I would hope that the Premier would commit to updating these contracts and posting them, and perhaps providing us with them, you know, but in time for tabling as we go forward with respect to discussing the budget. Can I get a nod or an affirmation on that? Yes. Oh, sorry. I think you have to turn on your mic.
Yes, of course. That would be normal procedure, and I'll ask that be done as soon as possible.
And can I assume then that the conditions of the employment have changed, and to some degree the benefits would likely have increased to reflect the promotions?
Well, I have an acting chief of staff who's continued his same compensation under the same terms of his position as principal secretary prior to January the 4th. And we just appointed a deputy chief of staff who's come on board, I think 2 weeks ago, and that may be why her contract's not yet posted. And so she's new to the office. And then a director of policy, Ms. Behrman, who had joined us a few months ago from Minister Tay's TBF, Treasury Board and Finance. So two of them are new to the office, and one is has the same contract, effectively acting in a different role.
Sorry, excuse me, Ms. Notley, just so you know, I will interject just for the ease of the operator of microphones, then you don't have to worry about pushing it on. And it just paused it a little bit going through the chair, but again, it signals the operator for a little bit more ease. So Ms. Notley, you have the floor, and then I will indicate the Premier to respond and back and forth.
Thank you. You bet. The only thing I would follow up with on that is that, in fact, your Chief of Staff, the contract that is posted is, I guess, a little bit more out of date than we thought then, because as far as we can see, it relates to when he was a senior advisor in the Ministry of Advanced Education. That is the most recent contract. So if we could get that one going. So then I also note that in your office there are no contracts posted for your Executive Director of Communications and Planning, Policy Advisor, Ben Harper, a tour and scheduling person named Shannon, a scheduling officer named Lisa, and a digital coordinator named Danielle. Now, I do understand that the Act only requires people who earn over $111,000 to have their contracts posted, so that might be why they are not. It was certainly our practice when we were in government to have all political contracts posted, regardless of whether they were above or below that amount. So I'm hoping that that would get posted.
Premier?
Ms. Notley, I'll certainly look into that. I must confess I wasn't aware of whose contracts are posted and whose weren't. So I'll take a look at that and see what the criteria are. And how that relates to the legal requirements and standards. So we'll get back to you.
All right. Now, I know that because these contracts are available, and we've had a chance to look at some of them, we do understand that they include severance provisions, that people would receive severance should their employment come to an end. But of course, there is an exemption to eligibility for severance should termination occur with cause, and cause is defined as including, although it's not exclusive, as dishonesty, failure to disclose requested information, breach of fiduciary duty. Now, my understanding is based on a media report in mid-January that your former Chief of Staff did in fact receive his severance. And can you just confirm for me that that's correct?
Premier?
Is correct. Per the provisions in his employment contract.
Okay, so here's where I have a few questions then. You're and give me a bit to sort of pull this together. You yourself did say in a public statement, Premier, that your Chief of Staff had displayed what you characterized as terrible judgment. Now, we know that you announced a lockdown on December 9th, and it took effect on the 13th. And above and beyond advising Albertans that they should stay away from each other and their family at Christmas, it also, of course, advised against non-essential travel. And this has obviously been a pretty well canvassed issue. You also stated that you found out about the vice chair of your Emergency Management Cabinet Committee, EMCC, on the 29th of December. And then on January 7th, you stated that you became aware of your Chief of Staff's travel, quote, as he basically was on his way to the airport. The thing of it is that, and then you went on to say that you don't have comprehensive lists of everybody in amongst the hundreds of government, political staff, and senior officials and others who may have traveled abroad. So this is a bit curious, because we're aware that on November 24th, your Chief of Staff directed ministerial offices to send vacation requests to him. So that was on November 24th. And so we assume that when Chief of Staff makes that direction, that's what happens. In addition, we're aware that on December 16th, his assistant was helping him to arrange for his trip abroad by arranging for phone coverage. Totally reasonable thing to do. If you don't get that done, then you end up incurring massive phone charges. So I'm a little concerned, frankly, that your chief of staff, in fact, by way of this document, was the person that would have been told about people, including members of cabinet, including the co-chair of EMCC, going on vacation, and that he also was clearly making plans to go abroad with his assistant, who I suspect worked around the corner from your office. Certainly, that's more or less how it worked when I was in your office. And yet, you only became aware of this as he was driving to the airport. So I'm just troubled by this, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and how this might actually relate to the fact that he remained eligible for a severance, when it seems to me that this would suggest that either he ought not to have been eligible for the severance, or conversely, perhaps there was more awareness than we were ourselves all made aware of.
Premier to respond.
Sure. Thank you, Ms. Notley. So I've addressed all of that in response to several questions at news conferences on New Year's Day, as well as I think January 4th, or 3rd or 4th. And I'll just reiterate my very clear recollection with respect to Mr. Huckabee, is that he came into my office a few days before Christmas. I forget exactly what day, and I guess we could look it up in my calendar. And we exchanged some pleasantries, and he said, well, I'm off. And I said, where to? And he said, well, going home, and then we're flying out to London, and I think later that day. And so I was a little bit taken aback, but I thought, this is his call. In retrospect, I obviously should have said that would be really a bad judgment call. And I took responsibility for not having intervened at that point in those news conferences. I did become aware of Ms. Allard's presence in Hawaii when I think it was on December 29th, when the news stories started to emanate out of Ontario about former Minister Phillips. My office began to make queries with MLAs and ministers about their whereabouts. That's where we found a number of members of the government caucus had traveled outside the country, and we asked that they come back to Canada as quickly as possible. And as you know, there were further consequences that we announced on that Monday, which I think is January the 3rd, if I'm not mistaken.
Just one quick comment. I have allowed some latitude on the question of severance. I believe that further conversation about vacations would be outside of the realm of estimates, but if the official member of the opposition would continue on the estimates course, I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure. So I just want to wrap up, though, on the issue of severance, because one of the things that we didn't really hear about in previous conversations with the media was, well, first of all, that Mr. Huckabee had clearly planned in advance, but I guess you've acknowledged, obviously, that he must have, but also that he was the one to whom ministers were giving advice that they had vacation plans. And so that is a new piece of information. It's certainly not something that I recall hearing in the media in that period of time in January. So my concern is, given that ministers, and in particular the co-chair or associate chair of EMCC, was specifically directed to advise Mr. Huckabee of vacations, and then you didn't, and Mr. Huckabee came to talk to you on some date, I don't know what date it was, and mentioned that he was planning to leave, and he didn't mention that your associate chair of the Emergency Management Cabinet Committee was also planning to leave the country. It just strikes me as a strange thing that would still render him qualified for a severance.
Premier?
Can you hear me? All right. Sorry, it's taking a couple of seconds to get these mics and turn on in this room. So, Mr. Chair, I would simply say that Mr. Huckabee, I think, exercised poor judgment, which he has acknowledged to me, as have other of my elected colleagues, But Mr. Huckabee did not do anything illegal, nor do I think he did anything unethical. He has had an employment contract through the Premier's and Minister's staff employment order, which falls within the parameters of that order, which included a severance provision, which has been respected. So there's a legal obligation on the employer to respect the severance provision. That's the technical advice we received, and that's why he received severance, as did members of your staff when they left your office in the past. I understand $6 million in public funds were used for government staff severance after the 2019 election. So severances are part of the employment contracts, and we respect the law.
Thank you.
Well, again, sorry. And because this does ultimately relate to our approval of this line item in the future.
Sorry, point of order has been called. Ms. Rosen?
Thank you. Under 23BI as well as 23C, we have yet to hear a line item for this budget, nor do I understand how vacation requests tie into budget estimates. Also, we are needless repetition. This is the third time we've had the Premier now about to answer the same question. So point of order under both of those grounds.
Scanlon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is clearly, in my view, not a point of order. Not only did Ms. Notley reference the line item, because this is under the Office of the Premier and Executive Council, and as noted, that's line 1.1. This money, this severance, is clearly paid out of the budget. It is clearly relevant. $50,000, in my view, is not an insignificant sum of money. It is clearly relevant whether or not this money was paid to someone who was not, in fact, legally entitled to severance.
Thank you very much. While I am inclined to agree that this line of severance is in the budget, I have previously asked the official leader of the opposition to continue down the vein of estimates, and I would ask her to conclude this conversation and continue with her questioning moving forward. Thank you very much.
Well, I will move forward, except I will allow the Premier one more chance to clarify what he just said, because I read into the record the language of the contracts, which are, of course, appropriately part of this conversation, which talk about the exception from the entitlement to severance in the case of termination for cause. I read out what amounts to termination for cause, and I articulated the new evidence that there was information that was critical to the coordinating and planning of government work throughout a pandemic that was not obviously shared, or according to the Premier, at least, was not shared with the Premier. And it would therefore, I would argue, trigger the exclusion from eligibility for severance. So if the Premier wants to continue to say that no, even though his chief of staff was the person to whom people needed to report when they chose to leave the country, and that it was appropriate for his chief of staff not to tell him that his associate chair of the Emergency Management Committee of Cabinet was leaving the country, then fine, I will move on. But I'm going to give the Premier one more chance on this.
Premier, if you would like to respond.
Again, the advice I received was that Mr. Huckabee's employment contract, the terms of it required that severance be honored, and that's exactly what happened.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ms. Notley.
On the matter of EMCC, then, I'd like to move on to that. There have been critical times over the course of the pandemic where, you know, the intensity of the pandemic has waxed and waned. And of course, there was a time in November where the Premier, quite appropriately, was compelled to isolate, actually twice, I believe, but in November it was the second time because of exposure, and I can absolutely understand how you can't avoid having people around you in the job that he does. But I can also, my recollection, of course, is that Executive Council is quite brilliant at giving you all the possible technology you could possibly ever use so that they have full-on 24/7 access to you, even while you're forced to isolate. And the reason I ask about that is because during the 12th of November to the 24th of November, which was part of the time when the Premier was in isolation, we saw cases go from about 800 cases to 1,600 cases per day, each day. So it was quite a critical time. And because, you know, during that time, there was a point where even the Premier's sometimes friend, Rick Bell, characterized the fact that he hadn't heard much from him as a head scratcher. You know, we FOIP'd the schedule and your schedule, Premier, and we noted that the EMCC didn't meet at all during that time. And so, or at least it wasn't on your calendar. So I am curious as to whether the EMCC met without you? No.
All right, that just concludes the first 20 minutes. There will be another 20 minutes. Please continue, Ms. Notley. Or are you ready for the Premier to respond?
No, he can respond, yeah.
Premier, if you would respond.
So the Emergency Management Cabinet Committee has not met since, I believe, May or June. We shifted the COVID response to the Priorities Implementation Cabinet Committee, acting as what we have informally called the COVID Cabinet Committee. So EMCC effectively, we decided to streamline the decision-making process and moved EMCC functions over to PIC. And certainly I had many meetings, both formal and informal, throughout that week when I was in isolation with respect to the pandemic.
Thank you. Ms. Notley?
So then maybe, okay, just on that, perhaps you could clarify for us, because during that period of time, I will say that the calendar anyway appeared quite light, and, you know, particularly given the intensity of the pandemic at the time. And roughly a third of the time, if not a bit more, during that time was booked as executive time. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us what executive time was, because I didn't actually see the other committee that you referred to identified in your schedule either during that period of time, but I did see quite a lot of time as executive time, and I'm unfamiliar with what that includes, because normally, you know, there's 1,000 people trying to get access to your decision-making authority, and so unscheduled things are kind of.
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order has been called. Ms. Rosen?
Again, on 23BI, is there a line item that pertains to the Premier and his cabinet's calendars? And if so, I would love to know which one.
Scanley? Or Ms. No.
No, absolutely. For the member, it is page 3-4 of the business plan, referencing again 1.1, 1.2. It is absolutely the job of the Executive Council to coordinate and align the work of ministries. CCO does that, PCO does that, PIC, I think is the right word, does it, and it's all about the work that they are doing during the worst government crisis in, I don't know, arguably a century. So that is exactly the work that is done in this ministry in these estimates.
Thank you, Ms. Notley. I appreciate that. That is helpful to know that. I appreciate when you do tie it to the business planner estimates. Not a point of order. Ms. Premier, you may respond to Ms. Notley's question.
Sure, thank you. So I'm advised that I chaired meetings of the Priorities Implementation Cabinet Committee during that period on November the 11th, November 17th, November 19th, November 23rd, November 26th, and I do recall many of those were quite lengthy meetings. And in some cases, that cabinet committee has met as long as 8 or 9 hours in one sitting. And with respect to executive time, that simply would have meant me being constantly on the phone or doing video meetings with senior staff, senior officials, the Minister of Health, people in his department, et cetera. My recollection, I was in my Calgary home that week, and I was pretty much had a phone growing out of my ear the whole time, in constant communication, primarily, but not exclusively, about pandemic-related matters.
Thank you. Ms. Notley?
Well, I think we'll probably have to follow up on this in a different setting. What I will say is what we received through FOIP does not actually align with what your officials have just reminded you of. So we will need to follow up to find out why the schedule that we received through FOIP does not align with what's going on there. Anywho, so the last piece on staffing relates simply to the work of two folks as it relates to issue management and communications. And again, because this is an item, the reference is, again, 1B, and also the estimates document reference is page 103, Office of the Premier Executive Council Operating Expenses, and talking about the fact that we are approving salaries for these folks going forward. Obviously, I understand that people who work in your office, the political staff as well as the public staff, work very, very hard, no questions. And they, it's a fascinating and also stressful job because you are dealing with many, many different things coming at you many, many different times. And of course, the job ultimately, in accordance with what is set out in your performance measures in your business plan, are to do those jobs, to align the work of government on behalf of the people of Alberta in as objective way as possible, and to support the best interests of as many Albertans as possible. That I'm taking some editorial leeway there, but that's basically what I believe that they do. However, as the Premier will remember, our caucus, on behalf of a number of people, have been very concerned about the way in which the tragedy in Alberta's meatpacking industry has unfolded over the course of the pandemic. And I note that in April of last year, as we had the first outbreak at Cargill and the announcement of the first death at Cargill, we've seen, or we've just recently received documents that suggest both your former Director of Communication and your current Director of Issues Management were engaging with CPE in terms of what information should be articulated in the, I believe, what were the regular daily briefings by Dr. Hinshaw. And in particular, there were a couple of different interventions to simply to change the direction so that when reporting on the first death at Cargill, that quote-unquote context was provided to make sure we understood that the first death was someone over 60. And context was provided to suggest that, well, it might not have just been Cargill because there was transmissions in people's homes. And so I am troubled that your Issues Management Director and your Director of Communications seem to be engaged in not issue managing for the people of Alberta, but rather issue managing for Cargill. So I'm just wondering whether this is an ongoing thing, whether we can expect to see more of this going forward, or whether we might see them actually take a slightly less aligned position, shall we say, for the sake of diminishing responsibility of an employer that ultimately hosted the largest outbreak in North America, and an industry in this province that hosted the only deaths in Canada.
Thank you, Ms. Notley. I have allowed some latitude with that. I would appreciate you drawing it to the estimates of Executive Council and the future look of that. Premier, if you would like to respond.
I'll do my best, although I must admit I'm not entirely clear on the precise question. First, let me say, and I'm sure that Ms. Notley and all members join me in this, and an expression of condolences for those individuals whose lives were lost. Of course, all 1,900 Albertans who have passed away as a result of the pandemic, including those in the meatpacking plant industry. Secondly, I'm not aware of what discussions happened between my staff and the Ministry of Health in that regard, but I do know that Dr. Hinshaw has stated repeatedly her concern that much of the transmission associated with those outbreaks occurred outside of the immediate workplace, that and she said this to really to learn from that and to be self-critical of the government's response, to say that we needed to respond more quickly to the potential for transmission in large workplaces like that outside of the workplace. And we changed policy to start providing for free hotel rooms to facilitate self-isolation for people in working conditions and living conditions of that nature.
Ms. Notley?
Okay, well, we'll leave it there for now and take this opportunity, because I'm thinking, how much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
You have 10 minutes and then an additional 10-minute block.
You bet. Okay, sorry, so 10 minutes, so 20 minutes still?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to move on to some of the conversations that you identified in your opening remarks, Premier, with respect to intergovernmental affairs, and that relates, in particular, you did mention the matter of the fair deal for Albertans and the work that you would suggest is being led through your office with respect to that. And of course, I don't think I need to, I mean, I can link, it's, part of 2.1, 2.2 of the business plan, page 103 and page 177 of the estimates document. Now, I guess the first thing that I just want to clarify is it the case that where are we seeing the money set aside for the referendum that was one of the recommendations of the Fair Deal panel? I know it's not in your particular, in the Executive Council, but where is it?
Premier, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, the administration of an election would not be responsibility of Executive Council, but I do know that in the budget, funding has been provided to municipalities to work with us in the administration of a concurrent referendum on municipal voting day later this year. And I'll ask if officials can help me find the reference in the estimates. I guess it would be under JSG. So we'll get back to you with exact reference to that, Ms. Notley.
Thank you, Premier.
So now I understand that obviously the Fair Deal report has made a number of recommendations, and one of them, of course, was this idea of talking about equalization, and I gather that's one of the items that will be part of the referendum. However, there's also been a lot of conversation about the future of CPP and the idea of pursuing an Alberta pension plan. And I believe that it was in roughly July of 2020, the finance minister committed that a referendum would be held on CPP. Now, I am just curious, will you be planning and will you today commit that in October, with the referendums that are being put forward as part of the outcome of your Fair Deal panel, which of course is an extension of your work in intergovernmental affairs, just to keeping it relevant. Will we in fact be seeing a referendum on CPP in addition to a referendum on equalization?
Thank you, Ms. Notley.
Sir, go ahead, Chair. Thank you for the question. The answer is that the government has not yet decided whether we will proceed with the referendum on the question of a potential provincial pension plan. We are awaiting the results of a technical study being led by Treasury Board and Finance, which in cooperation with external experts to look at the costs, the benefits, and the potential structure of an Alberta pension plan similar to the Quebec pension plan. It was a recommendation of the Fair Deal panel following its consultations that we proceed in that direction, but we are doing the technical study. If the conclusion is that it would be a net benefit to Alberta and our economy while strengthening our province, then we may proceed with that referendum. Final decisions on that will be made later this spring.
Thank you, Premier. Ms. Notley.
Thank you. So can I conclude from that, that should your technical report conclude that proceeding with an Alberta pension plan rather than a continuing on in the Canadian pension plan is a good idea, that you will not proceed with it unless it has been included as part of a referendum and put to the people of Alberta?
Premier.
Sorry, Chair. Yes, Ms. Notley, I've been clear about that we would only proceed, as I've said to you in the chamber many times, if Albertans approve of it in a direct vote.
Premier. Ms. Notley.
Okay. Then, carrying on that issue and the various issues arising from the fair deal conversations, there was a time when you were talking about setting up sort of a little mini Alberta embassy in Ottawa, in Montreal, in Vancouver. And I am just curious where that is at. And where we would, if that's happened or if it didn't happen, and where, in fact, the line items exist for that.
Thank you. Premier.
Thanks very much. So yes, it was our intention. In fact, our election platform included a commitment to have a bigger advocacy presence across the country. And it was our intention in 2020 to open a Alberta advocacy office in Ottawa, partly so we could, of course, I deal and our ministers deal with political leadership, but we want somebody who can be the equivalent of an ADM, a senior official who can engage with the heads of agencies, with departments on more technical issues that really touch on Alberta's interests. Similarly, we think it would be very useful to have a full-time voice for Alberta, both an investment promotion function, but also to defend our province's interests in the energy and other sectors in the Quebec National Assembly, with the government, and with other key opinion leaders. But all of those plans were interrupted by the pandemic. It was not practically feasible to establish new offices when people couldn't really travel or hold meetings generally. So those plans, Ms. Notley, are on hold indefinitely. I do hope we can come back to them, but they're not a line item in the estimates because they've been frozen by the pandemic.
All right. Thank you. So it's not currently a plan to go ahead with them in the upcoming fiscal year. Then on the issue, though, of having offices and people representing us in offices in other jurisdictions, and you did mention your role in liaising with governments across Canada as well as foreign governments. You had, I believe, I'm trying to remember just a second, let me check my notes here. Still checking and flipping, sorry for the delay. Here we go. In April of 2020, you appointed James Rajot as Alberta's senior representative to the United States to work out of Washington. And at the time, he was to be paid a salary of $249,600, and his job was to make sure Keystone XL gets done. Now, I assume that he was not actually a political appointee, so we don't see him on the list of political appointees that are circumscribed by the Public Sector Transparency Act that would govern your political staff that we talked about earlier. I assume that in appointing him, he was a member of the public service, but he's also not on the sunshine list through the public service either. So I am curious as to why and where Mr. Rajat's salary lives. Has he been appointed? Was his appointment delayed? Is he receiving a salary? Has it just moved on? Where is that?
Thank you. Premier?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I'll just offer a brief response, and then if you don't mind, I'd like to ask DM Gilmore to fill in with additional information. But Mr. Rajat's position has existed in Washington under governments for, I think, well over 25 years. It's a mandate broader than simply Keystone XL. It's a mandate to represent Alberta's interests in the country where we have over $110 billion of exports. And in terms of the exact nature of his employment contract, DM Gilmore, could you speak to that? Oh, he has to go to the podium. I'm sorry.
And thank you, Premier. If he can just introduce himself by name for the record before he speaks.
My name is Ray Gilmore, Deputy Minister of Exec Council. And just to add to what the Premier said, he certainly has been employed through the Department of Jobs, Employment and Immigration. And he will be up on the contract on the sunshine list. The rules around that is that twice a year by June or by December, anybody who's signed new contracts will be posted on that list.
Thank you very much. That concludes the second 20-minute block. Ms. Notley, for your final 10 minutes, you may begin.
Okay, well, I guess I just sort of want to follow up with that because he was appointed in April. He was to have started May 1st of 2020. So I'm not quite sure why we wouldn't have seen him in June or in December. So that's my first question. And my second question is, has he actually been located in Washington that whole time, or has he been working elsewhere?
Premier?
Or virtually?
Sure.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, it's taking some time to get the mic on here again. So Deputy Minister Gilmore has undertaken to get back about why that wasn't posted earlier. In terms of his location, he is co-located with the U.S. Embassy, has an office there, which, as Ms. Notley will know, has been the arrangement for a long time, and works through the Department of Global Affairs. There's a kind of service contract between the Government of Alberta and that federal ministry to provide co-location and administrative and other support, including housing support. But I do know that he's been back and forth between Edmonton and Washington, primarily because Washington has largely been shut down in terms of the ability to meet with people. And so he is, I believe he's actually back in Washington right now, but he has spent some of his time kind of getting set up here with Jobs, Economy and Innovation, working on the phones and with Zoom and video conferences, and some of his time in Washington. But I think now, hopefully, with things starting to open up and getting a little bit closer to normal in the United States and Washington, he'll be there on a permanent basis.
Thank you, Premier. Ms. Notley.
So last question on this. The reason we are concerned about this, obviously, I mean, $250,000 is not nothing. Obviously, Keystone, not a big win. And that, of course, was actually what exactly he was described as being focused on when the announcement was made last April. But also, I'm very aware of the office that you refer to, been there myself. And if you go to the directory for that office, Mr. Rajat appears on it, as do the other staff at that office. Unfortunately, there is absolutely no contact information for Mr. Rajat. So it's not possible for someone who wants to perhaps connect with an emissary from Alberta to reach Mr. Rajat, because there's no email, there's no cell phone, there's no address, there's nothing. So I'm just a little concerned about how that work is getting done, or has been done, or will be done going forward.
Premier to respond.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I did not say that Keystone XL was not part of his mandate. Obviously, a very important part of it, but I said it wasn't the only part of his mandate. He's been working on many other critical files, including, of course, Line 5, Line 3, exports generally. I do know that with respect to KXL, our senior representative, Mr. Rajat, spoke to, I believe, over 65 congressmen and senators, as well as many governors. He liaised closely with the heads of the major building trades unions in the United States. and with many other critical stakeholders. He has spent hundreds of hours doing that important work. And I do believe Mr. Gilmore wanted to provide supplementary information on the posting of the contract.
Thank you, Premier. Ms. Notley?
Mr. Gilmore?
Sorry, just to add to a point of clarification. So anybody that's employed from January to December is posted in the following June. And anybody that has a severance from January to June is posted on the Decembers. So his will show up in June.
Thank you for that. Ms. Notley?
Okay, well, thank you very much for that clarification. I would appreciate if you could also advise us as to when he's been in, give us more information and provide this committee with more information about the occasions when he's been in the U.S., the meetings, all the things. I mean, hundreds of hours is great, except obviously there's far more than that in any given year, and it's quite a significant salary, and it's a new position. So we would just want to see a report on how that's unfolded. And it could be tabled here with the committee.
Premier to respond.
Yeah, I'm not sure which is the appropriate legislative committee, but I'm sure that Mr. Rajat would be delighted to present to any relevant legislative committee on his work and that of his office.
Thank you very much. Ms. Notley?
My hope is that information on that can be tabled as part of this estimates process before, in the legislature, before we are asked to vote on the budget.
All right. Premier?
I would just clarify that the budget for his office is within the Department of Jobs, the Economy and Innovation. So I think that information, the information that Ms. Notley is requesting, would most probably appropriately be tabled at that committee that's dealing with JEI estimates.
Thank you, Premier. Ms. Notley?
Indeed, but that, I believe, has already occurred, and Mr. Rajat's role was primarily described and led through Executive Council, and so I'm just asking that that be directed through your ministry to table it appropriately before we have to vote on this going forward. I'd like to switch now to a matter that we did discuss or in question period today, but it also does very much relate in more detail to estimates, to the budget, and to the, to the business plan, as well as the fiscal plan, as well as the strategic plan. And that, of course, is on the issues of jobs, job creation. And indeed, it was one of the highest named priorities of the government when in much of their documentation. So what we do not have yet is a clear understanding with respect to the way in which the budget is dealing with Alberta jobs now. We saw that there was projections of $136 million being spent on a job creation and education retraining program in the upcoming budget. We also know that that is part of the $185 million that was provided by the federal government last fall. We also know that there's roughly $60 million that are booked in the current budget to be rolled out the door by March 31st. Yet it's March 10th, and there's been no announcement about this, and no employers have been, or business owners or anybody, have been given the opportunity to apply for that $60 million. So the concern, obviously, is that this is money that came from the federal government. None of it has been expended yet. It appears in the budget, even though there's been a clear admission by your finance minister that that the rules around rolling over federal money, in this case, don't allow for this much money to be rolled in to future years, and that it's not been confirmed that the federal government will agree to this. So why is it actually appearing in our budget as a done deal?
Premier to respond.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have every expectation that the Government of Canada will approve our proposed program design for this revised and expanded job training program, which would proceed on a cost share basis. As Ms. Notley will know, there are a number of labour force agreements between the province and the federal government that are partnerships. I understand from Minister Copping that most other provinces have made the identical request to ours for the allotment that came through part of the Safe Restart Agreement to be from the federal government for additional transfers on job training to be reprofiled into the fiscal year that will start in April.
Premier, Ms. Notley, you have just under 1 minute left.
Okay, well, I guess I'm just, I mean, I guess I'll have to get back to this, but I'm quite troubled that if there's no approval, the idea of putting it into a budget seems pretty sketchy. It's not typically how, like, I understand we have massive contingency dollars in other categories, but to me, that's not what this is, and that's not the way it's being reported. It is quite troubling. I'd just like to go back to one thing. November 20th, 2020, we had over 1,100 cases reported, 11 deaths, and there was actually, according to the schedule that we have here, no COVID briefing on that day scheduled in your calendar. Regardless of what committee it had migrated to or from. And so my question is, why is that?
So that concludes the first 50-minute time period for the official opposition. We now will go to government caucus with no independent members. Sorry, we will go to the government caucus for 20 minutes of questions from their members. Who is taking the first questions for government caucus?
I believe I'm up, Chair.
There we go. Thank you. Mr. Walker, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and hello to all of my colleagues, and especially the Premier and all the senior officials at Executive Council and the Premier's office for being here. This is an important occasion for this committee to ask.
Okay. We seem to have lost Mr. Walker. Yes, can you please pause the clock? We will have to get Mr. Walker to relog in. Government caucus, do you have someone who can? Oh, Mr. Roswell?
Yeah, I'm available if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. We'll ask Mr. Walker to relog in. We will start the clock again. Mr. Roswell, please proceed.
Okay, thank you. With respect to the business plan on page 48 in section 2.4, one of the key objectives of Executive Council is to collaborate with other ministries and jurisdictions to reduce red tape and barriers to internal trade. This includes reviewing Alberta's exceptions under the New West Partnership Trade Agreement to reduce wherever possible and working with other governments through the regulatory, reconciliation, and cooperation table to reconcile existing regulatory measures that act as a barrier to trade and cooperate to align new regulatory measures. Now, I know I've heard people say that sometimes it's easier to trade internationally than it is between provinces. And I know you've done some easing unilaterally to try to initiate stuff. But I was just wondering if you could give us an update on the progress on negotiations with other provinces in reducing the international trade barriers within Canada.
Premier to respond.
Yes, and if you don't mind, Chair, I'm just going to quickly respond to Ms. Notley's last question. I didn't get a chance to respond. She was asking why there was nothing on a freedom of information return on my schedule on a particular day, November, for briefings. I'm advised by senior officials here that cabinet meetings like the, I think, 8 or 7 meetings I chaired of the Priorities Implementation Cabinet Committee operating as the COVID Cabinet Committee that week, that cabinet meetings are not, they are subject to cabinet confidence, so they are not FOIPable, to use that term. And I can once again assure her that I was in constant contact with my office and senior officials about the pandemic throughout that week, including that day. Now, in response to MLA Roswell's question, thank you. Our government made a strategic decision to show real leadership on the dream of achieving free trade of goods and services in this country, rather than sitting around haggling. The previous NDP government had actually increased the number of exceptions filed by Alberta under the Canada Free Trade Agreement, and unfortunately developed a reputation for protectionism, of thickening barriers to internal trade. I believe that Alberta has, because of our free enterprise culture, our export-based economy, benefits from greater domestic trade. There are some economic estimates that the Canadian economy loses as much as $130 billion a year in potential wealth because of interprovincial barriers and to trade for goods and services, but also to mobility of workers, of professionals and tradespeople. So that is why Alberta has eliminated unilaterally 80% of our exceptions, under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. We've also taken a leadership role with the 3 other Western provinces to invite the rest of Canada to join us in the New-West Partnership Agreement, which is a much higher trade agreement, higher quality trade agreement. In fact, the length of NUEPTA is shorter than the length of pages of exceptions filed under the Canada Free Trade Agreement. So it's a much better trade agreement as a legal platform. We are in fairly advanced negotiations with the Government of Ontario about potentially acceding to NUEPTA, which I think would be a game changer in advancing the cause of internal trade. We're also pleased with the progress that's happening under the Regulatory Reconciliation and Cooperation Table, most recently with respect to construction. We are very much focused right now on knocking down non-tariff barriers to the export of Alberta spirits and beer to other provinces, which we think have unfair barriers to our exports for our great products. And by the way, I think we have a great story to tell on that. And finally, as I've announced, we had commissioned a study from the C.D. Howe Institute into the feasibility of a legal model for basically the unilateral recognition of trade and professional credentials from other provinces. The single costliest aspect of domestic trade barriers in Canada relates to barriers to the mobility of labor. And as a province that has always been a net beneficiary of interprovincial migration, and that in good times faces labor and skills shortages, we think it would be manifestly to Alberta's advantage to significantly streamline that whole credentialing process. So it's my intention to come forward to the legislature in the autumn with a bill that is modeled on the European Union approach to unilateral recognition of professional and trade certification.
Yeah, thank you. And sorry.
No, go ahead, Mr. Roswell.
Okay. Yeah. So then, so the response or the reception from the other provinces at this point looks promising. And is there anything the federal government can do to help out with that?
Premier?
Qualified yes on the first question. You know, when we get together as premiers and talk about this, of course, a lot of these discussions have been kind of, unfortunately, sidelined because of COVID. But there's always goodwill around the table at the level of top political leadership. Unfortunately, my observation is what then happens is various special interest groups get involved in protecting their own, lobbying to maintain protections for their own industries or preferences. You know, it can be quite, sometimes it can be a bit of whack-a-mole. We had one of our neighboring provinces, it's a province that's hard to pronounce but easy to draw, that recently imposed very strong preferences for road builders in there, and that basically cut out Alberta contractors. That was very disappointing. When I raised that with my counterpart, he immediately acted and removed those preferences. So it's sometimes we feel like we're playing whack-a-mole. On the other hand, Premier Pallister, Manitoba, outgoing Premier McNeil in Nova Scotia have been strong champions of the trade agenda. It cuts across party lines. And we are very hopeful the government of Ontario will find a way to join us in NUEPTA. And we do think the federal government can and should take a stronger leadership role. I said to the Prime Minister in our first meeting the week that I was sworn into this job that the federal government has constitutional superpowers to achieve the dream of confederation as an economic union. I've strongly encouraged him to use those powers, as I have the new Federal Minister of Intergovernmental Relations, Dominic LeBlanc. And I hope that they will take a stronger leadership position on that.
Roswell?
Thank you. That's, and carry on to the next person.
Government Caucus, who would be the next person? Mr. Tour.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Premier. With respect to the business plan, Premier, at page 47, it states the Cabinet Coordination and Ministry Services provide organizational and administrative support to Cabinet and Cabinet committees, leads corporate planning and reporting for the ministry, and support state officials working on private visit to Alberta. Premier, can you explain the function of the Cabinet Coordination Office and the cost associated with the office?
Thank you, MLA Tour, for the question. So the Cabinet Coordination Office effectively, they're their air traffic controllers, if you will, of all of the policy work that goes through the Cabinet system. As you know, as a member of the Government Caucus, we've set up an informal process at the front end where ministers brief members of Government Caucus on the general themes of a potential policy change. And then based on that, the input that emerges from that, it goes to a Cabinet committee. There's a memorandum to Cabinet written by the minister, which may involve proposed regulations, proposed legislation, proposed policy changes. If it passes that stage, it then goes either to the Priorities Implementation Cabinet Committee, operating as what is colloquially known as the Inter-Cabinet, or the entire Executive Council, the whole Cabinet, for ratification, and sometimes for a separate study. Now, what the Cabinet Coordination Office does is to coordinate that whole process, the flow of the scheduling, the flow of all of that information, all of those proposals between the ministries, cross-ministry work. They have a budget of $916,000, which is 5% of the total Executive Council budget. And we've had a very busy year. This past year, they've helped to coordinate 120 meetings representing 1,048 items for discussion. And so they've been working, really overtime throughout the pandemic.
Mr. Tour?
Thank you, Premier, and I'll pass on to, I think, MLA Armstrong.
Ms. Armstrong-Hominick?
Good afternoon, Chair and Mr. Premier. Chair, through you to the Premier. With respect to the business plan at page 47, it states the Policy Coordination Office works with all ministries to support the development of policy options that align with the government's agenda and coordinates the review and approval of government regulations. Can you, Mr. Premier, explain the function of the Policy Coordination Office and the costs associated with the office, please?
The Premier.
Clarification. I talked about support for these Cabinet committees. The policy support comes from the Policy Coordination Office. The Cabinet Coordination Office does more of the kind of, as I said, air traffic control. And the Policy Coordination Office has a budget of $2.9 million, which is about 17% of the total Executive Council budget. And they make sure that, for example, ministers are providing adequate information to Cabinet committees for decisions to be made, that all of the necessary aspects of a decision are being considered, their fiscal implications, legal, constitutional, social, and other implications. So in a sense, they provide a quality control function to the Cabinet decision-making process, and they also provide direct support to me on occasion in terms of policy advice. I see that they have supported 99 cabinet committee meetings this past year, dealing with 721 different proposals. So again, they've been extraordinarily busy.
Ms. Armstrong? Homnick?
Thank you. Thank you. Chair, through you to the Premier. With respect to the business plan at page 49, can you, Premier, explain how the Executive Council plans to continue to improve on its performance metrics and with respect to the services provided by the Executive Council to the other ministries?
To the Premier.
Throw that to you, Ray. I'm going to invite DM of Executive Council to respond to Ms. Armstrong-Homanyuk on that point, how we're going to improve our performance. I think we have pretty good performance metrics. I'll just point this out. First of all, we don't deal with a lot of clients. My department is not an operational, we don't deliver surgeries or pave roads. So it's more difficult to measure my department's effectiveness. But the main metric we use is surveys with people within the government and how they rate our performance. And they're pretty good. Generally, the ratings are in the 80. We've gone up from 82 to 87% for the policy and cabinet coordination offices. We've gone up from 72 to 77% on advancing the government's agenda, the measurement within the government for that. And Colleen leads the most popular, apparently, part of governments. They've gone from 92 to 97% in a positive rating on supporting other ministries on intergovernment relations work. But Ray, how are we going to do better than that?
Well, thank you, Premier, and to the committee. So as the Premier mentioned, we're very busy and we coordinate across government. The techniques or the styles that we use to try to continue to improve on that is strong communication across government and an awareness and clarity as to what's coming. As I'm sure all of you can appreciate, when policy is put together at the pace and at the pace that we're working at, it requires strong communication. There's always going to be a conflict or some type of a discussion required because of the different interests that are always required to be met. And we find that through strong communication and as we go forward, that helps us in that regard. We will continue to work with all of our deputies and all of our ministries and try to see where there's ways we can improve and enhance the performance and the results that come forward. And we have regular meetings throughout the year where we have these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Armstrong-Homanyuk?
I cede my time.
To
Mr. Guthrie. Sorry, there you are.
Mr. Guthrie, you have approximately 5.5 minutes left.
Thank you. Thank you, Premier, for being here this afternoon. With respect to the business plan at page 48, key objective 2.2 and 2.3, it states that the Intergovernmental Relations, IGR, works with all ministries to ensure a coordinated and consistent approach to intergovernmental relations and approves all of Alberta's intergovernmental agreements. So IGR supports the Premier's intergovernmental agenda, missions, and meetings. Naturally, Premier, you and your office have done a tremendous amount of legwork dealing with other provinces and the federal government to bring about awareness of Alberta's contributions to the entire country, and thank you for that. I feel that over the course of the last year, COVID may have overshadowed some of the great work that you've been doing. But Premier, can you give us an update of how intergovernmental relations is advancing Alberta's interests with Federation?
To the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Guthrie and Chair. Through you, Chair, to the members. This has been a really busy time for intergovernmental relations because, as I pointed out, there's been so much need for collaboration across the country on our COVID response. And that's why the pace of meetings has been unprecedented to have. We have the Council of the Federation, is the 13 provincial and territorial premiers. Typically, we'll meet once or twice a year. But in the past year, we've met once or twice a week often. And similarly, the First Minister's meeting, which is basically COF plus the Prime Minister, and some federal ministers, we've been meeting on average every other week to discuss all the different aspects of the national response to the pandemic and the associated economic crisis. So that's been the main focus, I would say. You know, some of the highlights there would be the Safe Restart Agreement, where I believe Alberta received, if I'm not mistaken, $1.3 billion in funding from the Government of Canada, our proportionate share. There was a lot of hard negotiations around that. Right now, let me just say, I have been so impressed and so often moved emotionally by the support shown to Alberta during the crisis, at the height of the crisis, 11 and 12 months ago, when our energy, the price for our energy, our largest commodity, was falling off a cliff to its lowest levels in history, when we were selling Alberta oil at negative prices about 11 months ago. And I was raising the alarm about the potential total decimation of the country's largest industry. I heard incredible voices of solidarity, not just rhetorical support, but provinces with much smaller economies that have struggled and have depended on things like equalization, saying to the Prime Minister, we need to stand behind Alberta during its time of need. Alberta's been there for us and the rest of Canada for decades. We need to be there for Alberta now. It made a real difference on so many levels in those months of crisis last spring, and in practical ways. I'll just share with you. Few months ago, 3 months ago or so, I guess it would have been in September, come to think of it, the then chair of the COF, François Legault, was organizing a national news conference to articulate the province's primary collective priority right now, which is significant increases in federal health transfers. And the then president of COF, Premier Legault, called me to say, Jason, we have not forgotten about what the unique situation Alberta is going through. And I want to add into this communique our unanimous support already stated for Alberta's demands on the fiscal stabilization program, that the caps on it be lifted both prospectively and retrospectively. Okay, I'm getting the signal, but that's just one sign of how this spade work, the relationships have really paid off. We've also made progress. You know what? We have a lot of major issues of disagreement with the federal government. I'd be happy to speak about those all day. But we've also gotten some progress. The equivalency agreement on the tier major emitters levy, equivalency agreement on methane, which is going to significantly reduce regulatory costs versus federal regs. The Chapter 11 agreement on the Species at Risk Act for the caribou protection plan. And we're now working with the feds, of course, on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So I see two bundles of issues, those where we have total conflict, like Bill C-69, the retail carbon tax, UNDRIP ratification, and many other issues. And then issues where we actually, a bundle of issues where we are making progress or do believe progress is possible.
Thank you very much, Premier. That concludes within seconds of the 20-minute block for the government caucus. Now, I do have just a quick couple of COVID challenges that I'll try to address here very quickly before going back to the official opposition. For everybody involved, I do try to introduce the speaker predominantly for Hansard to be able to switch the microphones so we don't have to touch those. One of the other challenges was during the government time, the Premier did answer Ms. Notley's last question. I don't know if you heard it or not. The Premier could not have known that you left the room because of the COVID technical things. I did check with the clerk. Calendar dates are not necessarily related to estimates. Estimates are forward-looking, and while comparisons to the previous years do provide context and are allowable, I would more firmly ask that we address the focus on the current estimates moving forward. And I will provide a moment, if the Premier would like to restate his answer to Ms. Notley while she's in the room, I would give him a moment or two to do so. You did hear it already, so that is not required. Thank you very much for that, Ms. Notley. So now we move to the next round, which consists of 5 minutes of questions from the members, followed by 5 minutes of response from the Premier. As mentioned, members are asked to advise the chair at the beginning of their rotation if they wish to combine their time with the Premier's time, which I believe was stated, so we will continue with the shared time. No person may speak longer than 5 minutes at a block. Please remember that discussion should flow through the chair at all times, regardless of whether or not speaking time is combined. With that, I assume, Ms. Notley, you begin a 10-minute block.
Thank you very much. And my references for this, I'd like to talk about jobs, job creation, and job creation efforts. My reference, of course, is the strategic plan, which says on page 6 that jobs and growth are the defining mandate of the government. I doubt that the Premier would disagree with me on that. And then, of course, again, under 1.1 and 1.2 of the business plan, as far as ensuring that the work of the government is coordinated, in essence. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that because there's been a lot of numbers being thrown around, and I am kind of a stickler for accuracy. And so I look in the fiscal plan, and I see that there is talk of a $3 billion job creation plan or economic recovery plan. I see, for instance, press releases saying we are going to create 90,000 jobs with the capital plan. And this is a bit troubling for me because, in fact, neither of these things are really accurate, and I think that Albertans need to have a chance to really dig through what is new here, what's incremental, what's being added to the government's effort, how much of a strategy is there really to create jobs in this province. So let's start with capital. As has been discussed in previous estimates, although we support the incremental bump of $1.7 billion to capital investment that appears in this budget, it's kind of what I would characterize as low-hanging fruit. It's not as much as what we did in 2017 after the recession there, but it is a classic effort. That $1.7 billion bump does not create 90,000 jobs. That $1.7 billion bump might create roughly, based on multipliers used in other jurisdictions, about 8,500 jobs, which is not nothing. Those are important jobs, and I think they're very worthwhile. I just really want us to be using appropriate numbers. We are maintaining the employment of tens of thousands of people, maybe even 90,000 people, as a result of maintaining capital investment as the government of Alberta, absolutely, for sure. But we are not creating new jobs, and we're certainly not creating that many. But it's good to keep people employed. I would be the first to argue that, and I will argue that many times over in many different settings. So that's the first thing, unless the Premier wants to suggest that that's incorrect. The other thing, though, that I'd like to get into a little bit is that the remainder of that $3.1 billion is made up primarily of either federal money, pre-existing tier money, or this $500 million contingency. And I'd like to get to that, and some people get really irritated with me when I obsess over the contingency, but again, I'm a stickler. Contingency means maybe. Contingency means we will spend it if we need to, not we are going to spend it. And so it's really quite confusing to Albertans when you see $500 million under a contingency. So I want to ask the Premier, is it their plan to actually spend $500 million on economic recovery? Yes or no? Is it a contingency, or is it actually a plan to spend it? And if it is a plan to spend it, how will they spend it? Because meanwhile, what we've got in here is some lovely verbiage of about 9 different strategies which are not described and have no dollar figure attached to them, and the finance minister and the jobs minister are not able to attach any projected jobs to those strategies. So we've got a lot of fluff and not a lot of plan. So maybe the Premier could start by telling us what his plan is with that $500 million contingency and why it is that we call it that.
Mr. Premier, you have up to 5 minutes.
Yeah, I thank Ms. Notley for the thoughtful question. She invited me to respond to her remarks on the capital plan. Let me just underscore that the 90,000 job figure is an estimate that was, I believe, made by the Ministry of Jobs, Economy and Innovation based on the standard models that would have been used by her government in the past to translate capital investments into employment and into FTEs, full-time equivalent employment statistics. And The reference there is to the $20.7 billion in planned capital spending over 3 years that is embedded in this budget, which is a increase over where it had been. We are sustaining record high levels of capital investment, and the estimate from Jobs, Economy and the Innovation Department is that represents approximately 50,000 direct jobs and 40,000 indirect jobs sustained over that period. And of course, this represents as well counter-cyclical spending, which is there to address the collapse in the global economy. We're essentially borrowing that money right now at pretty low interest rates, but 1.75% is our current bond rate, to make those investments, many of which will help to make our economy more productive in the future, many of which are addressing strategic priorities. For example, the $240 million investment in modernizing our irrigation infrastructure in southern Alberta, the first renewal of that infrastructure in 60 years, which together with support from the local irrigation districts and the Canada Infrastructure Bank represents an $800 million renewal. It will increase massively the arable land, the crop yields, will likely entice additional food processors to come into your hometown of Lethbridge, Mr. Chair. That's just one example of how the capital plan supports the broader Alberta Recovery Plan and our sector strategies to speed up our economic diversification. With respect to the $500 million contingency for job creation to which Ms. Notley referred, yes, I can assure her that will be expended. In fact, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say that Minister Toews is going to have a challenge on his hands to prevent expenditures in excess of the $500 million for targeted investments to support the growth strategy. And you know, I totally understand Ms. Notley's questions and even her skepticism on this. Because, yeah, in an ideal world, it would be preferable to enumerate everything we plan to do in that area. But we're not living in an ideal world. We're living in a COVID world. We're living at a time of unprecedented uncertainty. And we're just admitting that. We're just admitting that like, we're working on the completion of a number of sectoral strategies. We have a number of ideas of where some of those investments will be made. And I know Minister Schweitzer and Toews have shared those. But we're not in a position to lock ourselves in for like a year from now, when we're in such incredible flux. God forbid we should see new variants beat the vaccine programs around the world and drag us back into a global COVID recession 2.0. But those are the kinds of real possibilities in the year ahead of us that we must maintain. I would implore Ms. Notley to, our view is we must maintain a margin of flexibility. The other way we could do this would be to not put it in the budget, not be transparent about our spending intentions, instead just roll out supplementary estimates which are authorized not by the legislature but by the cabinet and are only done retrospectively instead of prospectively. I think this is a much more honest and transparent way of saying we will have to make some strategic economic investments. Here, the legislature is allotting us X amount of money. We'll do our best to stick within that, and as opposed to just making it up as we go along through the supplementary estimates process.
Thank you. Ms. Notley?
Well, I would argue that what this budget reflects is making it up as we go along. Fact is that we've had a year. You've had a year to put this together. You had a council that you established almost a year ago. We expect more detail than a $500 million walking around money. I do, however, appreciate the Premier's clarification that those 90,000 jobs will be sustained. And I would ask that he ask his communications people to stop saying created, because indeed that is a primary difference. But congratulations for sure on sustaining those jobs, and I hope that he takes the same approach to jobs in healthcare, jobs in education, jobs in child protection, jobs in supporting community resilience, jobs in post-secondary education, because we do need to sustain jobs that are funded by the taxpayer right now, because that's part of ensuring an economic recovery right now. We cannot not impose austerity onto the economy and expect growth to come from it. So sustenance is great, but let's make sure it crosses all areas of what the public sector does. I gather I am now finished till the next time. Thank you.
That does conclude your 10-minute block. We now go back to Government Caucus. Is it with Mr. Guthrie? Oh, Ms. Rosen, you begin a 10-minute block? Ms. Rosen?
Okay, oh, sorry.
You begin a 10-minute block. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much, Premier, for being here today. On page 103, Section 2 of your budget this year, it shows a fairly large increase to intergovernmental relations. And I believe that this increase is primarily for the hiring of an environmental social governance secretariat. Now, I can attest to you that there is no one in this province who values and understands more the importance of balancing our economic recovery and revitalization with the importance of protecting and conserving our environment and promoting our brand as a wonderful place where we balance those two things. And in fact, I believe that the creation of this role was something that a couple of constituents of mine, whom you and I both know quite well from BANF, have advocated long and tirelessly for, and something that I'm very excited and proud to see that our government has implemented. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to what the roles and responsibilities and the purpose of this Environmental Social Governance Secretariat are, and how those roles and responsibilities will complement the roles and responsibilities of the Canadian Energy Centre. And also, I suppose if you can elaborate on that a little bit further and just explain how this new secretariat will support Alberta's interests beyond just the energy sector and into other sectors as well.
To the Premier.
Thank you, Chair, and to MLA Rosen. First, let me underscore that there is no new spending associated with the creation of this Environmental Social Governance Secretariat in Executive Council in my department. This is $2 million that's being transferred to my department from the Department of Energy to bring that critical work more into the center of government, where we have a kind of convening power, if you will, a convening role across all departments and agencies. And we can play that coordinating role. Now, I think to a lot of Albertans, when they hear this acronym ESG, they might think it's, I don't know, some kind of a medical term or something. It's fair. It's only in the last perhaps 18, 24 months that it's become an increasingly urgent issue for Alberta. It refers to a matrix for investment that is influencing capital markets and financial institutions based on E, environmental, S, social, G, governance metrics. And it has been ESG investment criteria have been used, I would say misused, by some large institutional investors and financial institutions disproportionately in Europe to effectively blacklist the Canadian oil sands and the Alberta energy sector. We think that's been based in part on dishonest, incomplete, dated, and torqued, highly politicized data driven by campaigns by green left organizations that, as you know, as MLA Rosen knows, have been trying to landlock Alberta energy through a deliberate campaign, the tar sands campaign, for the better part of 13 years now. And so that is in part why our government ran on a commitment to push back with a $30 million budget allotment for advocacy of our responsible energy sector. Now, by the way, a lot of that money was already being spent in advertising campaigns in the past. 10 million of it comes from the TIER fund for major emitters. 10 million of it is reprofiled from the previous government of Alberta energy advertising campaigns. So that $30 million fund resides at the Department of Energy. We're taking $2 million, bringing that into Executive Council to have a kind of like a central coordinating function to look at what are the gaps in our own ESG story? Where do we need to do better or additional research? What data do we need to update? Should we be contracting more expert third-party academic research on the shrinking carbon intensity or emissions from the Alberta energy sector? So part of it is that research and policy function. Part of it is identifying what are the top advocacy targets. Who's responsible? Who's best suited in the broader government of Alberta to carry that message? I'll give you an example. The new Invest Alberta agency will be the primary voice on our ESG message to those global capital markets in places like New York, London, and Frankfurt. The Canadian Energy Centre may have a mandate to advertise to a more popular, widespread general audience, for example. So the ESG Secretariat will coordinate activities both on the research side, policy coordination, and advocacy efforts. This is critical. I know a lot of Albertans say, what is this all about? At the end of the day, the oil and gas companies and their associations tell us that this is their single greatest current challenge. We can get them pipelines to ship increased capacity. We're producing, by the way, record levels of crude from the oil sands right now today. We can have strong prices. We can have all of those things. But if they don't have access to capital to maintain and expand their projects, then they're going to run out of, they won't have a bright future. So we need to work with them on this ESG imperative, and that's why we've set this up at the center of government.
Thank you. Ms. Rosen?
Thank you so much, Premier. I will cede the rest of my time currently to Mr. Guthrie.
Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you. Premier, earlier discussion from this committee meeting, we were talking about referendum questions and IGR. Now, equalization is such an important issue to so many Albertans, and it's a topic that this government has agreed to address at the fall municipal election. Could you comment on what that question would look like, its significance to Albertans, and how can and this position Alberta in its discussions with the federal government?
Premier, you have 3.5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. Of course, Chair MLA Guthrie knows very well that the United Conservative Party ran on a key commitment to hold a referendum on the principle of equalization that is articulated in Section 36 of the Constitution Act since 1982, since the Patriation. We have not yet finalized the question. We did ask the Fair Deal panel to consult and confirm whether we should proceed with that. They did. That was their advice. And so we have confirmed that it will be held concurrent with the October 2021 municipal election for the sake of administrative efficiency and convenience of voters. Also, I often get asked by some Albertans why we have not yet had that vote. And one of the answers is that we've wanted to maintain something out there as leverage in our relations with the Government of Canada, dealing with issues like construction of Trans Mountain, expansion, construction of Coastal GasLink, and so many other vital issues. You know what, if Mr. Guthrie or other MLAs have suggestions about exactly what question to ask, we'd be happy to take those on board. Cabinet will be making a decision later this spring on the precise question. But I just need to add this caveat, as I always do. Holding this referendum will not in and of itself change equalization or other unfair aspects of the entire system of fiscal federalism. We cannot change the Constitution, for example, unilaterally. But what we can do through this referendum is to elevate our fight for fiscal fairness to the top of the national agenda, taking a page out of Quebec's playbook and how they have so powerfully dominated, frankly, the politics of the Federation for half a century. So I would refer Mr. Guthrie to some of the recent op-ed written by former Alberta Finance Minister, Professor Ted Morton, that I think really articulates that theory very well.
I think there's a lot of Albertans looking forward to this fall and having a say on that. So thank you very much. I'll cede my time to
Mr. Turton.
Mr. Turton.
Mr. Turton, you have just over 1 minute.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Premier, for coming here today and obviously for answering these questions. I know you've had obviously a long week, but it is very much appreciated on behalf of the residents of Spruce Grove and Stony Plain. As you have mentioned numerous times this afternoon, and I guess I'm going to be specifically talking a little bit about intergovernmental relations, because I think at no other point in our province's history has that position and that line item been so important in terms of working with other provinces and the national government in Ottawa about how we can further Alberta's interests. And you've touched on a little bit about the conversations you've had with Premier Legault and other provinces about how we can get through the COVID-19 pandemic. And you kind of touched a little bit on the conversations that you've had and also the conversations that we need to have with the federal government. Not just to be able to deal with the medical crisis of the pandemic of today, but also of the economic uptick that we have to go through as we get our province out of the conundrum that we're in and move on to tomorrow. So
I apologize for the interruption. That concludes that 10-minute block of time. We now go back to the official opposition for a 10-minute block. Ms. Notley, you have up to 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I think it was my plan anyway to touch on the issue of the ESG Secretariat. So I'm glad that that was raised. I will start, maybe I'll just try to put my questions together because I'm worried that we've got short time and then you can follow up. I've just got my eye on the clock here. First of all, I find it somewhat amusing that you suggested that some people might think ESG is a medical term, but that it's become a big issue in the last 18 months. I'm sure you are aware that in 2019 you actually called it a fad to the Globe and Mail yourself, just outside of 18 months ago. I can actually assure you that those were real issues probably for a decade, and it didn't suddenly shift from being a left-wing green conspiracy theory to suddenly being an issue that you needed to pay attention to. In fact, it's always been an issue we needed to pay attention to. So I'm glad you're sort of there. The problem is that it does appear as though you are still, and the government is still riding two horses. And of course, that never ends well for anyone but the most skilled of rodeoers. And so I want to say we are quite troubled about this. So on one hand, you are acknowledging that the oil and gas industry struggles to get investment as a result of ESG concerns, which drive investment decisions internationally in multiple forums, separate and apart from any conspiracies. Yet, on the other hand, we are doing a number of things in this government. Like, for instance, we saw performance measures in the Ministry of Environment, 4 out of 5 of them, I believe, removed in this budget with respect to emissions reductions. Gone are measures around total emissions in the oil sands, total emissions in the electricity sector. The only metric left is percentage of emissions priced. So to me, that runs counter, and it looks like somebody's not doing a very good job of thinking about ESG matters. Then in terms of social license, although, yes, we do have work with respect to Indigenous communities through the IOC, we also see significant budget cuts to the Department of Indigenous Relations as far as it relates to consultation. When we look at transparency and effective governance, also not a fad, actually a thing that investors look at. We, of course, see the multiple challenges with respect to transparency around, for instance, KXL, the coal leases, the $500 million that may or may not get spent on projects that may or may not ever be itemized for Albertans. So we do seem to have a bit of a challenge here. I guess what one thing that I would like to know is how you are going to bring that together, because of course the other thing we've got is an energy war room, which has been an international embarrassment on multiple fronts, and we have the inquiry into un-Albertan activities, which most recently spent $28,000 to actually buy junk climate science. So these things run counter to the very ESG goals that international investors look at. So it seems to me to be rather wasteful to be spending $2 million to present a picture to international investments of a government that respects ESG standards while at the same time dealing with the theatrics of the War Room and the ever-delayed Allen inquiry. And finally, I will ask, I understand that we spent $125,000 on the Eurasia Group, led in part by Gerald Butts, the former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Trudeau, and I am wondering if this money, part of it will go to continuing to ask for their assistance in connecting with investors, because certainly the description of that contract was that they were going to be doing the very ESG work that you described to your previous MLA from Banff Kananaskis. And I believe I'm pretty much, again, out of
14
time.
seconds. Yeah.
All right, yep.
So to the Premier, you have up to 5 minutes to respond.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that was more sort of a grab bag of political points rather than specific questions about the estimates. I'll do my best. Let me say, first of all, that Ms. Notley has accused the government of, quotes, trying to ride two horses simultaneously. No, there's only one horse, and that's called Alberta, and the direction is towards a prosperous future. I understand, and it's entirely legitimate that Ms. Notley and her party have always been hostile to this province's largest job-creating industry. The NDP historically in this province has existed to oppose what they've always referred to as, quotes, the corrupting influence of big oil in Alberta's political culture. That's why they opposed the Northern Gateway pipeline. It's why they opposed the Keystone XL project. It's why they surrendered on the de facto federal cancellation or killing of Energy East. It's why they sought to impose massive additional costs on rendering our industry uncompetitive in a trade-exposed environment. And we fundamentally happen to just disagree with that. The government that I'm privileged to lead was elected with a mandate unapologetically to respond to the campaign of lies.
Sorry, Mr. Premier, I interrupt. A point of order has been called. Ms. Scanlon?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I call a point of order under 23B as well as HI and J. So that's speaking to the matter at issue and also seeking to create disorder. Clearly, there were some questions asked. Yes, it was asked in the non-back and forth format of a series of questions, which are then given a series of time to answer. But this sort of performative tangent about what previous governments may have done or may not have done is certainly out of scope of the estimates. We're here, we have a very limited amount of time. We're here seeking information that Albertans are entitled to about how public funds are being used. And I think it's not only off topic, but extremely disrespectful to Albertans for the Premier to be using the time in this manner.
I'd like to respond. Mr. Guthrie?
That's clearly not a point of order. The opposition may not like the answer, but the Premier is well within his rights to answer the question. As he's noted, it was a grab bag of information that was thrown at him. He's trying to do his best here to get through that. So it's clearly not a point of order.
I would tend to agree. I've allowed quite a bit of leniency throughout the entire estimates. Ms. Notley used almost the full 5 minutes of her time. The Premier will be able to continue his remarks. He has approximately 2 minutes left of his time.
Ms. Notley referred derisively to the campaign to landlock Alberta Energy as, quotes, a conspiracy theory. It is anything but. It is a highly coordinated campaign. It's not a theory, it's a reality. It's called the Tar Sands campaign. It started at a conference organized by the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation in 2008 in New York City. This is highly well documented. A couple of dozen organizations, highly coordinated, constantly sharing tactics and strategies. Those are the groups that have been behind trying to shut down everything from Northern Gateway to Trans Mountain expansion to KXL to Line 5 to Line 9 to Energy East, desperately trying to bottleneck this province. And that's where we have a fundamental disagreement with the NDP. They want to defend those organizations. That's where they come from. I understand that. It's a legitimate political choice. But Albertans have chosen a different path. Now, in terms of concrete progress on ESG issues, by the way, we are, after Norway and Denmark, the most highly ranked country on earth. with respect to ESG metrics. And our energy producers are the most highly ranked amongst global energy producers. You would never know that if you just heard from voices on the political left. But we have to do better, and we are doing better, which is why we've rolled out the TIER program, why we've cooperated with the federal government on methane equivalency, on regulations. It's why we just formed a working group with the Government of Canada on potentially a massive expansion of carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology. So we can and must do better, and we are leading the way to being the best, most ethical, and most environmentally conscious major producer of hydrocarbon energy in the world.
Ms. Notley, 16 seconds.
Will you or will you not be spending money on Eurasia? And why did we remove 4 of 5 emissions targets from the budget plan? Those were my questions.
And to the Premier,
Yeah.
one more
Chair,
time. But if we just have literally 1 minute, 40 seconds left, I will leave it with the Government Caucus, Mr. Searle, to use that time as he chooses.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Premier. You heard my preamble before, so I'll just sum up my question real quickly. Can you please explain how Alberta is coordinating with the federal government and other provinces to address the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as take advantage of potential economic opportunities?
To the Premier, you have 1 minute, 15 seconds.
Right. Well, thank you. You know, we have major, in some cases, massive disagreements with this current federal government on issues that are vital to our economic future. But we have sought to be productive, as I think Canadians expect of us throughout the pandemic. And we do appreciate various forms of federal support, just as we've demonstrated leadership in sharing tens of millions of dollars worth of personal protective equipment with other provinces in the country. Right now, we continue to focus on the need for them to show us good faith by lifting retrospectively the cap on the fiscal stabilization program that would be worth several $billion to Alberta. And we join with our fellow provinces in asking for a fair deal on the Canada Health Transfer, given how the federal share of health funding continues to decline as health costs continue to increase, particularly in the COVID crisis.
Mr. Turton, for the final 15 seconds.
Yes, no, I'll just simply say, thank you again very much for your response, Premier. I appreciated your answer, and especially the candor that you've had regarding the challenges and opportunities that you face as you deal with other provinces and the federal government. I have a great hope and optimism.
I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Turton, but I must advise the committee at the time allotted for consideration of the ministry's estimates has concluded. I would like to remind committee members that we are scheduled to meet next March 10th, 2021 at 7 p.m. to consider the estimates of the Ministry of Labour and Immigration. Thank you, everyone. This meeting is adjourned.